Hello, my name is Perolini and I'm the Program Director and Senior Lecturer at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. And my colleague is Naomi Hay from the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. Our presentation titled Reflecting on the Urban and the Regional Designing for a Post-Urban, Post-COVID Future discusses an ongoing research project that examines existing Australian planning approaches and suggests design responses needed to meet the challenges and opportunities faced by shifting socio-spatial patterns, tailoring approaches to specific regional circumstances in Australia. In the past 3 years, record-breaking bushfire and flood events have killed too many people and billions of animals. Drought, cyclones and freak tides have gripped communities. Climate change is a key concern for residents in Australia. So is the cost of living, and these issues are converging like never before. We live in times of ecological, geopolitical and socio-economic uncertainty, escalating effects of climate change, natural anthropocentric disaster, population growth, uncontrolled urbanization, environmental degradation, conflict and displacement, growing economic disparity and a global pandemic have created conditions of vulnerability for millions of people around the globe. As a nation undergoing rapid development, Australia is not immune to these issues. Australia's current population of over 25 million people is projected to increase to between 36 and 48 million people by 2061. The vast majority of the country's population live along the coastline, with 90% of Australians occupying only 22% of the country's land area. 2/3 of these live in a capital city, with urban growth rapidly expanding into peri-urban areas, impacting both the environment and the availability of farming land. Along with the country's projected growth and increased urban footprint comes expanding requirements for infrastructure, resources, housing, transportation, water, food and energy production, in turn correlating to increased consumption, population waste and resulting environmental impact. As described by Henri Lefebvre, this invasion of the urban fabric is all-encompassing, extending beyond the city and reflecting upon the broader relationship of humans and environments as the urban continues to envelope the rural, villages, towns and cities of all sizes. The changing face of Australia's settlements requires consideration of future conditions of risk that will arrive in each community in the near future. Whilst Australia's unique environmental, geographical and climatic conditions require handling with care, the tendency to follow influences of external planning movements in the design and construction of our built environments has done untold damage. Some are vulnerable through economic disparity, socio-spatial segregation and disconnection of communities. Others are vulnerable through overpopulation, suburban sprawl and poor planning decisions. Urban planning in Australia occurred during the early phases of the colonial era from 1788 to 1901, followed by the city's beautiful and garden city movement in the 20th century. Australia's rapid urbanization meant urban planning became an increasingly important issue, with the early decades of the century characterized by political, civic and academic discussion around the coordinated planning and administration of rapidly growing metropolitan regions. Early town planners focused on the orderly planning of cities, closely followed international contemporary town planning and urban reform movements, especially from the United Kingdom, where urban planning aimed to improve urban health, efficiency and aesthetics. During this era, there were two main approaches to urban reform: a movement towards the creation of a legal framework for town planning and efforts towards creating large metropolitan governments, known as the Greater City Movement. Things like height regulations came into effect during that time. However, the movement was later deemed entirely unsuccessful, and following World War II, progress towards metropolitan planning was achieved through the creation of statutory planning agencies under the direction of the state governments. Today, The idea of a single metropolitan municipal government coordinating development and infrastructure is seen as a largely discredited model of urban and regional planning. By the early 20th century, the concept of owning a freestanding house on a quarter-acre block in the suburb, now referred to as the Great Australian Dream, was firmly entrenched in Australia's culture, and the roots of Australia's suburban sprawl had been planted. Today, there is a recognition that Australia's national policies on urban planning environments are seriously inadequate, particularly for the tackling of the climate crisis. Two types of actions are urgently needed in cities. Mitigation, which is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, including from manufacturing and construction materials and from the energy used to operate buildings, amenities, and infrastructure, and adaptation, ensuring cities can endure climate change impacts such as increased bushfires, rising sea levels, drought, heat waves, and other severe weather events. So, where are we today? There are a few issues at stake. We have socio-economically disadvantaged populations of Australia's major cities are substantially clustered into suburbs, now predominantly located in middle and outer metropolitan areas. And we have urban design policies which are seriously inadequate for tackling the climate crisis. It will be impossible to tackle climate change unless we transform the way we build and plan cities, which are responsible for a staggering 70% of global emission. Yet Australia's national policies on urban environments are seriously inadequate. Currently, cities are not prepared for the climate impacts. Decades of climate change knowledge are presently poorly translated into built environment policies. As the planet continues to warm, this will have dire consequences on Australia's most populated areas, such as exacerbating inequalities. In some at-risk locations, such as towns built on floodplains or in bushfire-prone areas, local governments will have to manage increasing climate change impacts on declining budgets as property values and revenue from council rates decline. Australia has experienced unprecedented environmental challenges in the last few years: prolonged drought, repeated floods, and widespread bushfires. The people who have suffered the most from this 1 in 500 year Northern Rivers flood events are those who were living on the flatlands of Lismore and elsewhere. The general pattern of social division has further been exacerbated in the Northern Rivers as a result of the region's housing crisis. As developers colonize real estate for short-term holiday accommodation, many community members are being forced to marginal accommodation in flood-prone areas, including caravan parks. The issue of flooding and disaster, however, reaches beyond human social divisions. It's quite obvious that some areas of the Northern Rivers that have been cleared and settled should never have been developed at all. Forests, coastal woodlands, intermittent lakes and wetlands ecosystems all hold water and filter it for a gradual release into the sea. They provide a buffering reservoir effect that modulates the destructive impacts of extreme rainfall events. As Australia counts the cost of another deadly flooding disaster, thousands of residents are facing an agonizing decision to rebuild or relocate. Relocation is a sensitive topic and notoriously hard to discuss in the aftermath. The idea of relocating an entire town in response to natural disasters has been around for centuries. A recent example of relocation lies in Grantham, in regional Queensland. In 2011, the Lockyer Regional Valley Council managed to move 120 households up the hill after what has been described as an inland tsunami, swallowing the town and killing 13 residences. Thousands of homes are unlivable in flood-ravaged towns that already struggle with accommodation shortages. Government data suggests that of the 9,200 homes assessed in the Northern Rivers, 5,500 are damaged and 2,900 are not habitable. There are an estimated 1,300 people in temporary and emergency accommodation. The recent COVID pandemic has further eroded the resilience of Australians. Many of us will be exposed to a disaster in our lifetime. In the past 2 years alone, Australians have lived through bushfires, flood cyclones, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Global and national life-changing events, the COVID-19 pandemic and natural disasters such as the ones explained before have substantially elevated levels of anxiety and depression relative to usual population data. The COVID-19 pandemic is disrupting the way we live our lives, but no, there is no exodus from Australia's capital cities. For some, pandemic-related disruptions might have heightened their dissatisfaction with where they live. For others, working from home might have provided them with the opportunity to consider alternative living arrangements. As opposed to Australia's sprawling cities, regional and rural areas are generally small in population with relatively few large population centres. There has been some movement towards decentralisation in the past, but this remains largely underdeveloped to date. However, with the release of the white paper Our North, Our Future, white paper on developing Northern Australia, the Australian government has placed regional development firmly on its agenda. To ensure that our regional centres do not fall victim to the same short-sighted planning mistakes, responses now need to meet the challenges and opportunities faced by shifting socio-spatial patterns, tailoring approaches to specific regional circumstances. The eastern seaboard has been hit by floods and bushfires. The northern rivers in New South Wales has been hit hard in the recent floods. Residences are going through their second major flood in months. On February 28th, the devastating first flood peaked at 14.4 metres, fully 2 metres higher than the previous record of 12.3 metres in 1954 and well above the town's 10-metre high levee wall constructed in 2005. Even as Lismore and the Northern River residents struggled to recover from the floods came again on March 29th. More heavy rain began falling onto the already soaked catchment, feeding into the Wilsons River, and it peaked at 11 metres. Once again, residents had to evacuate. While the height of the first flood is a new record, back-to-back floods have happened before. Brisbane also suffered 3 of the largest floods then recorded in rapid succession. Back in 1893, floods can come in clusters. As the world warms, the atmosphere can hold more water. That means we are more likely to see larger floods. It is time to rethink flood-prone towns. This is increasingly urgent, with a significant recent shift of city dwellers to Australia's region since the onset of COVID-19. The pandemic has brought to light the necessity of radically rethinking of how we live and interact with communities of all scales. Some Australians have returned to their workplaces after extended lockdowns. Some remain working from home, others remain unemployed or underemployed. The long-term ramification of the effects of the pandemic in areas such as health, mental health, social engagement and economic vulnerability are incalculable. Such complex issues situated across social, ecological, cultural, economic, spatial, political levels cannot be viewed in isolation. The difficulty lies in the complexity and intertwining of all problems associated with the scale of the issues and the speed with which different phenomena evolve. Reframing our ways of inhabiting the planet as a matter of urgency is therefore crucial. This involves engaging with scientific fact and engaging with issues of values, ethic and care for future generations, and raises the question of alternate ways in which to envision long-term futures of our built environments. Our research project will further discuss design responses needed to meet the challenges and opportunities faced by shifting socio-spatial patterns, tailoring approaches to specific regional circumstances. Thank you.